So my name is Tina Hovio, and I work as Executive Director for FFD, Food and Forest Development Finland, one of the agri-agencies and part of the AgriCode Alliance. I have the pleasure to open this second session of the training for African regional and national farmers organizations on the UNFCCC process, so the United Nations framework for climate change. This is organized in collaboration with Anders Hermes Akademie, Deutscher Bauernverband, World Farmers Organization, and Pan-African Farmers Organization. We have already had one session where we went through kind of a history and basics related to the climate change framework convention. This time, we want to focus on the annual circle of different sessions. We have so-called SB 58 meetings starting in Bonn next week. So we're trying to see what happens in this meeting, how it is linked to the conferences of parties, COP meetings, and go a little bit in detail on what is dealt in this meeting. So SB 58 that takes place next week. The program is the following. I'm now opening the training session. Then we'll have a presentation by Dr. Keris Jones, who is working for the British Farmers Union. She's also the climate advisor of focal point for World Farmers Organization and farmer constituency in the UN process. And we have a very short break. Hopefully the time allows us to have a 10-minute break at the end of this hour. And then we start again. And we'll go into breakout rooms. We'll split to Francophone and Anglophone breakout room, provided that there are sufficient people to have both. And there you will debate, how the process is, including agricultural actors, and what are your views if the topics are really sufficiently covered, the topics that you are interested in. And then we have a plenary closing. We discuss a bit of your findings of views from the breakout rooms, and then we reconvene again 20 past and close in 2 hours time. This is recorded. You noted when you entered the meeting that there is a recording going on. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. So the plenaries are recorded. And of course, there's interpretation available in the plenary session between English and French. I think that we have taken the time reserved for introduction. So I would like to invite now Keris to start with her presentation. Please, Keris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tina, and good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you, and thanks very much for the invitation. Tina, can I just check that you can hear me properly?
We can't hear you at the moment.
That's really strange.
I think that Tina, we can hear you, Keris, and others well. Tina, I think you may have something wrong with your microphone or like audio settings.
Okay, well then, if everyone else can hear me, I'll start and I'll share my screen so that we don't lose time. Can I check that everyone can see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, but it's not the present, like.
Yes, Keris.
Yeah.
We can, I can see your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All good? So, Tina?
Sorry, we can see the loss and damage slide. Maybe you go to the beginning.
So I am at the beginning. Let me stop.
Maybe you try sharing again, and it's not in the presentation form.
Yeah. Okay. So I can see the presentation in the presentation form, and it was at the start. So let me start again. Make sure that I'm at the start of my presentation. So where are we now? Are we at the first slide and are we in presentation mode?
You are at the first slide, but not in the presentation
Okay.
mode. Maybe if you allow, I could share. I have two screens, so it's easier.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start talking. Thanks, Tina. That's perfect for me. Hopefully good for others. So yes, I'll start again. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak today. As Tina said, I'm going to talk about the SB58, the Bonn Climate Conference, which starts next week. And this is part of this SB COP cycle. And I want to touch on who's doing the negotiating and the talking at these meetings, and then focus on what is actually on the agenda at SB58. Next slide, please, Tina. Thanks. So I wanted to start recapping, I think, on something that James said in his excellent presentation in the first webinar that you had on this subject. So this COP process is very much a cycle. So if we start with COP27 in Egypt last year, if we think about this current annual cycle, COP27 was in Egypt in November. 6 months further on, we're at the Bonn Climate Conference, SB58, which starts on the 5th of June. 6 months later, in November, we'll be at COP28 in Dubai, where the UAE is the president. This happens every year. So that's very useful for us as farmers organizations in planning our work. And the meeting next week is called the SB because it's a meeting of these two permanent subsidiary bodies. I won't read them, but you can see that one of the subsidiary bodies is about science and the second is about implementation. And there'll be many things on the agenda relating to those two bodies. Next slide, please. Shall I hand over to you now, Tina, to describe this question?
Yes. One of the issues we want to do is to get your engagement a bit more. And that's why we have introduced some questions which you can find, for example, through your computer or through your phone when you go to a site called menti.com. We also asked you when inviting to this session to find out a bit who are the members of the delegations that go to these meetings, the COP meetings, and also to the SBs. And this is now, we would like you to go to menti.com to the site and write the code 55117768. And now I'll take the Menti quiz here. When you find this site in menti.com, you have the code 55117768. Then you can write your answers. Do you know, were you able to find who are participating in this meeting? I give you a little bit time to find out the site. When you get to the site, you write the number. I write it to the chat as well. When you put the code, it takes you directly to this question. And if you didn't find who participated, you can also say that you don't know.
Tiina, can I just ask a further instruction? So do you wish to have like names of the persons or positions or
Anything.
anything?
So
okay.
if you know the institution, if you know the person, if you were able to find the information.
Thanks.
So you write there, if you know the person who attends the SB 58 meeting or institution. If you don't know, you can write, you don't know. When you're on the site, there are little boxes where you can write your answers. It seems that people don't find the site or they don't have anything to write. If I interpret this now right, it seems that people don't, okay, relevant government bodies, civil society organizations, yes, you know, lead negotiator. Very good. We can take this as a testing ground. There will be more Mentimeter questions. So now you know the access. I'll take now back to Keris's presentation. I shift this one and put the presentation on. And now we'll go into the party groups and observer constituencies. Please, Keris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tiina. Really pleased to see those answers because it is very confusing. So now I will try and describe the main groups that participate at the international level in this process. Governments do, of course, and but governments don't always work on their own, much like farmers' organizations. So in this international space, there are many party groupings where governments work together with other governments who think in similar ways, or because geographically it makes sense. And they work together for a common position. So the African countries will be members of many of these different groupings. There'll be members of the biggest group in the process called G77 plus China, which confusingly has more than 77 countries. There'll also be members of the African group. Some will be members of the least developed country groups or the Arab group. And actually in the discussion, it might be, when we have the breakout groups, it might be interesting to know, or for you to find out, which group your government is also a member of. Next slide, please, Tina. But it's not only governments that participate in the process or want to participate. It's really good to see in the Mentimeter question that some of you picked up that CSOs and others are part of the process. And in the process, everyone else who's not a member of government is called an observer. And there are 9 non-governmental observer constituencies. I won't read them all. You can see them on the slide. But importantly, in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that farmers, we have our own constituency. And these constituencies are quite loose groups of different types of organizations, but they have similar interests or perspectives, and that's true of the farmers' constituency. And there are also 2 other different types of observers. These are the UN agencies, so organizations like the FAO, but also intergovernmental organizations. And the IGOs include organizations like the CGIAR, the research organization that many of you might know about, but also the African Development Bank and the African Union Commission. Next slide, please, Tina. So the constituencies are the observer, I should get my words right. The NGO observer constituencies, the 9, are very different sizes. So the biggest constituencies are the environmental NGO constituency and RINGO, the research and independent observer organizations. So it's not surprising, as you'll see from this chart, that there were more RINGOs and ENGOs at COP26 than other constituencies. You'll see at the bottom that only a very small number of farmers were at COP26. There are a number of reasons for that, but we are also one of the smallest constituencies. And we might want to talk about how we might change that as farmers' organizations. Next slide, please. So who is the farmers' constituency? It contains farmers' organizations from across the world. Those farmers' organizations representing the smallest farmers to the largest farmers. But the important thing about the constituency is that everybody has an equal voice. We also have important organizations like AgriCord, who support farmers on the ground, but also others, organizations working in development in developing countries. And because this is such a diverse group of organizations, it can sometimes be difficult to find a common position and to come to agreement. But as farmers organizations, you know, I'm sure you know that. Like governments, we work throughout the year to prepare for next week, for example, for SB 58, but also for the COP later on the year. And the way we share information and experiences to develop our positions and priorities. We make submissions. So we submit our views in writing in the same way that governments can do. And those written submissions are another way of participating in the process. It doesn't always mean that you have to be at a COP or SB in person. And we're involved in this process because we want farmers to speak for farmers. It's a very confusing and complicated and frustrating process. But we have always been clear that if there's an opportunity for farmers to take the stage, that it should be the farmers' constituency and a farmer who speaks for us so that our voices are heard. But we can't work alone in this process. So again, when we come to the breakout, it might be useful to think about who else we should be working with to make sure that our voices are heard. Organizations or constituencies that we can find common ground with. Perhaps not on everything, but on some. Next slide, please, Tina. Thanks. I am now going to talk about what's happening at SB 58 at the Bonn Climate Conference, which starts on Monday, and then we'll have discussions and negotiations for 2 weeks. No, actually, although the official meeting starts on Monday, already negotiators and some constituency members will be in Bonn at some preparatory meetings. So there are a number of events on the agenda for the next 2 weeks. Specific for the negotiations that involve governments talking to each other. There is one agenda item which is specific to agriculture, and this is the new Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on implementation of climate action on agriculture and food security. It's not a very snappy title. And it's important that we're at this meeting so our voice and position can be heard. Although we don't get much opportunity to speak, but still important that we're in the room. And although this is the only agenda item specific to agriculture, there are many other important agenda items happening across the 2 weeks, which we would have an interest in, but currently we don't have the capacity to get involved. And that's something as a constituency that we want to do. We want to build our knowledge and experience of some of these other important agenda items so that we can highlight the things that we want to see happening in this space. And some of those important agenda items I will talk about later, loss and damage or the global stocktake, but also things like adaptation, capacity building, and finance. So those are the negotiations that are part of this cycle, this annual cycle. But the host of every COP also has an important role. So this year, the COP28 president is the UAE. So their job is to facilitate the negotiations, to make sure that the negotiations happen in a good environment, so that when all the governments come to COP, there's a chance that governments agree and we get good decisions on the next steps. So the presidency has a facilitative role, but it also involved in the process because it has its own priorities. So it will run events and discussions at lots of different levels on things that are important to it as a country. And in Bonn next week, it'll have an event on food systems transformation, on youth and nature and climate. And the COP28 president has been very clear that it wants this to be an inclusive COP. It's important to us as a constituency, but it's also interested in, not surprisingly then, giving a voice to Indigenous peoples and young people. And then finally in the events, there are a number of observer side events. For those of you who have been to a COP, you'll know these. These are the only opportunity that observer organizations have, the only opportunity they have to run their own event on any subject that they want. These are often linked to negotiations, so a different way of influencing the process. But of course, you never know who is listening to you. Thanks, Tina. Next slide, please. So for the next 4 slides, I'm going to talk about agriculture. And for the first 2 slides, I want to look at the past 6 or 7 years so we can better understand where we are now. So the agriculture negotiations under the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture were a series of technical discussions on subjects that are really important to us, on adaptation, on the management of soil, nutrients, livestock, and on the socioeconomic and food security implications of climate change. Like everything else in this process, this was a cycle. So you don't need to look at that diagram in detail, but I wanted to highlight 2 things. Firstly, this cycle, that over the 2.5 years of these technical discussions, parties and the farmers' constituency make a written submission on one of those technical subjects, livestock, for example. Then when everyone meets in person, either at the Bonn Climate Conference or at a COP, there is a workshop and a discussion about the submissions, and people hear from experts. And we were very fortunate as a constituency that we were invited to give a presentation at each workshop, and we also submitted a written response to each of those technical discussions. So we had the opportunity as farmers' organizations to represent our views. The second thing I wanted to highlight in this diagram is the time scale involved. So I said that the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture was a 2.5-year program. But actually what this diagram doesn't show is that for 2 or 3 years before this, there were many negotiations to try and agree on what work they would do. And then what you will see from the diagram is that after the last workshop in 2020, there were then another 1.5 to 2 years of negotiations to agree on the next steps. This can be really frustrating. And again, it's something, this long time scale, it's something that, again, we might choose to discuss in the breakout groups. Thanks, Tina. Next slide. So we've had a lot of talk over the past few years. So what lessons were learned from all these discussions and from the negotiation from this Coronivia work? So it was really helpful, and I was observing these negotiations very often. So it was really helpful, I think, that these were an opportunity to discuss and share experiences, to share information on best practice, and for countries to hear about the latest agricultural research. From a farmer's perspective, it was also, I think, really important for people who are not involved in farming to hear about the realities faced by farmers on the ground. The work highlighted the need for enhanced climate action on agriculture and the need for much better coordination, both inside the UNFCCC, because there are lots of different groups and bodies, but also with organizations outside the UNFCCC, like IFAD, World Bank, and the FAO. And that this need for action is urgent. It needs to happen now. We need to have all these things scaled up so that it makes a difference to all our farmers on the ground. Need to support capacity building, access to finance, and technological development and transfer. And for us as farmers organizations, this is not a surprise. And then the final point here, I think, is important for us as farmers organizations, and hopefully something that will we might touch on in the breakout group. And it also was one of the answers in the first Mentimeter question, that the Coronivia work was seen as important in building connections between different sectors, but also different ministries at the country level. So connecting Ministry of Agriculture with the Ministry of Environment. And this is important because generally next week at the Bonn Climate Conference or at the COP, it's generally people who work for the Ministries of Environment who are in this space. Farmers' constituency believe it's really important that we have agriculture ministers at the COP, but for farmers' organizations in country or in regions like PAFO, it's important for us to build our connections, not only with the agriculture ministries, because they may not be in person at the COP, but also with the environment ministry. And the other reason that this is important is because when government negotiators come to the COP, their position is already decided. They work throughout the year to develop their position. When they come, when they'll be in Bonn next week or in Dubai later on in the year, their position is already set. So we need to work throughout the year to ensure that when governments come to the COP or to Bonn next week, they can represent our position. Next slide, please, Tina. So after all the Coronivia discussions, we do have some important next steps on agriculture. Governments agreed this new 4-year program called the SHARM, I won't read it all, called the SHARM Joint Work on Agriculture. And it has, over the next 4 years, it will consider all the outputs from the previous Coronivia work. It may have workshops on new topics because the Coronivia didn't talk about everything. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a list of some of the possible topics for those feature workshops. And it would be interesting to hear from you in the breakout groups what subjects you want to see discussed. The farmers' constituency submitted some of its ideas, but there are always opportunities for new topics. And then the final item on the agriculture agenda is this discussion about an online portal for sharing information. And as farmers' organizations, we need to think about how this can be useful for us. What is it that we want this online portal to do? So we've already had lots of discussion. I've said this from a farmers' organization perspective, all this time and all this talk feels really frustrating. So what is going to be different over the next 4 years? How do we make sure that this is not just another talking shop? What difference is this really going to make for our farmers on the ground? How can the entire process be much more streamlined? How can we make sure that agriculture is important in other parts of the negotiation and to countries back at home? If agriculture had more prominence in the country's own plans, in these things called nationally determined contributions, would we have higher visibility across all the agenda items at the COP, not in just this one, in these one agriculture negotiations? And how will these agriculture negotiations increase climate finance for agriculture? Because climate finance for agriculture, particularly for smallholders, is only a very small, is a very small percentage of the finance available. So how can all these things make the lives of our farmers on the ground be better? Next slide, please. And I know you received some information before this workshop on what different countries have already submitted their views on what this new Sham joint work on agriculture would look like, what they want to see this work do. And all those written submissions will be the subject of discussion and negotiation in the next 2 weeks. So the African group of negotiators said they wanted to see these things: information sharing on technology, innovation, experiences. They want to see more partnership and cooperation, more peer-to-peer learning, capacity building, and sharing information on finance and capacity. And they listed a range of topics that they also wanted to see. Are these the right things? It'd be interesting to hear your views in the breakout session. And before I just leave this slide, the last thing to highlight is that every year, one country takes responsibility for speaking or submitting written responses on behalf of one of these party groups. So this year, it looks like Zambia is doing the work on behalf of the African group of negotiators. So Zambia will have coordinated the written response from the African group, and it may well be next week taking the floor on behalf of the African group. But obviously, every country still had the opportunity to speak for itself. Next slide, please. And Tina, I think now I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Keris. Now we would like to get your views. So I'm referring to the same menti.com. I'll put there a new question, and the question will focus on what do you think should be dealt with when you talk about SHARM implementation of work on agriculture and food security. I'll put now the menti.com again, and I shift the question here. So if you go to the menti.com, you see the address here above. You put the code 55117768 for those ones who didn't have time to go there yet. And those ones who are there, you should have the new question arising. If you didn't get the new question, press the button at the bottom of Menti site. There it says next question. And then you can write, what do you think are the topics that the negotiators who want to see implementation on agriculture and food security?
Yeah, open if you want. Yes, I still think that I will do the noodles.
Excuse me. It seems that some of the microphones are open. So go to menti.com and then you can write your answers. It seems that food losses and food systems are very important. Farmers' resilience and adaptation. I put into the chat the menti.com site and the code you have to put in to get to this question. And I have to ask for your apologies. I see that there are 2 yellow lines. I thought that I was only seeing them, but it seems I have no clue where they came from. It was in the previous Menti. I tried to get rid of them during the break. In this word cloud, if somebody is writing the same topic as you have now, food losses, then the letters are getting bigger and bolder, and you see that it's food security and food losses remain as centric for the work on agriculture and climate change. Now we have reached the end of the presentation. Before we take the break and go then into the breakout rooms, I would open the floor to any particular questions or clarifications. If you want to ask something, you can raise your hand or you can just take the floor.
Hello, Tina.
Yes,
I
Robert,
have,
please.
yes. I wanted to ask Cheris about the Coronovia joint work on agriculture. One of the focus areas is adaptation assessment. Then I've always wondered how is that undertaken? How do we have when it comes to adaptation assessment? Is there any framework for the same? And when we talk about adaptation assessment, who has to do that, or how is it done, by who and when? Yeah, that's my question.
That's a very good question, Robert. And you're right, in the Coronivia work, the very first workshop was on adaptation and adaptation metrics. So how you find indicators to assess progress on adaptation. I don't think, and so this is an answer, I don't have an exact answer for you, but I will go and find out and make sure that I share the information with Tina and Shadrach and AHA after this. I think different governments have to report on progress in adaptation. When they submit their plans to the process in their NDCs, they will have indicators, metrics, which they are using to assess progress on adaptation. And I'm sure that in research, also other organizations will be suggesting different metrics. So I don't think that there is only one way of assessing adaptation, but I will let you know. Were you asking the question because you're involved in a project where you have to assess adaptation? Or were you just generally interested?
No. I just was wondering because, as you know, when it comes to even the UNFCCC process,
Yeah.
The issue of adaptation seems like it's not given much attention.
Yeah.
Even in terms of resources, data shows that the focus in terms of resource allocation is 75 for mitigation and 25% for adaptation.
Yeah.
Then now my thinking is even as we pursue or we engage in this negotiation, I've seen the issue of finance arising in the question you just asked. Then some of those could be some of metrics or indicators we would like in the future to see. How much are we able to access? Because you know, we are our farming community are the one who are in climate front lines.
Yeah.
And we would like a situation where we are able to improve their resilience.
Yeah.
But now that might remain as a dream because little attention is given to adaptation. Again, everyone is on, even in terms of resource allocation, is on mitigation. And even the little which is there, then the issue of access is still a nightmare. So maybe if there could be any framework, then we need to put this on the table on such metrics and indicators to ensure that these resources are accessible to improve resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. You made some really interesting points there, and yeah, some interesting questions and reflections. And perhaps rather than answer them now, Tina, if you want, we can pick some of those up in the breakout groups. Up to you.
I think it's a good idea to discuss these in the breakout rooms. Keris has still 2-3 slides to go, just to indicate what other issues will be discussed in SP 58. I share the screen starting from the consecutive slide.
Yes, as Tina said, I have 3 more slides, I think. Yeah, 3 more slides that won't take very long. So this first, so I've talked about the past, the Coronivia joint work, and then this new negotiations on agriculture, the Sharm joint work on agriculture and food security. And although the Sharm work is the only negotiation on agriculture, there are lots of discussions and other initiatives on agriculture, and some of those are run by governments. And I thought it was worth highlighting what's been happening over the past 2 years, and perhaps think about the opportunities for us as farmers' organisations. So at COP26 in the UK, the US and the EU launched something called the Global Methane Pledge. Methane is a greenhouse gas, and agriculture is a big source, but it's not the only source. The oil and gas industry is also a source. And so there are many initiatives that countries, but also the private sector, are involved in to try and reduce emissions of this gas. And the sources in agriculture are either ruminant livestock, so cattle, sheep, goats, but also from rice and food waste. So there may be a number of projects that different organizations get involved in to try and attract funding, but it's still not clear to me how successful this initiative is and whether many projects are actually getting implemented. At COP27, agriculture and food security was very important to the Egyptian presidency. So for the very first time, there was a ministerial roundtable on food security, and the president of the WFO had was sitting around the table with ministers, which is very important for our constituency. But then Egypt, working with the FAO, also launched its own initiative called FAST, and that stands for Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation. And that initiative has 3 pillars on access to finance. And I think, Robert, I'm going to use your words. I think you said that access to finance is a nightmare. And I think governments feel that. I know it's even more of a challenge getting that finance to the ground and for farmers' organizations to access that finance. So it will be interesting to see how this initiative might make the situation better. And the other 2 pillars are around knowledge and building knowledge and capacity, and policy support and dialogue. Next slide, please, Tina. These last 2 slides are not about agriculture, but they're about 2 other subjects that are really important this year in the negotiations, but are also things that are really important to us. And the first is this global stocktake, which is a requirement of the Paris Agreement, which all governments signed back in 2015. And the global stocktake happens every 5 years. And the aim of this stocktake is to increase ambition, because everybody knows, science tells us that the world isn't on track to meet the target of being climate resilient and carbon neutral by 2050. So again, this 5-year cycle of a global stocktake aims to help governments be more ambitious, and be more ambitious in their bottom-up approaches through their nationally determined contributions. The global stocktake is important this year because it's the first, and so it's very important to the UAE president of COP28. So will be a big focus over the next 2 weeks in Bonn. And also important to the farmers' constituency, because we've been involved, we've made written submissions, and will be involved in the roundtables at Bonn next week. Because as Robert said, agriculture is on the front line. We know that that agriculture needs much more investment. If the world wants to get to those 2050 targets, it has to support agriculture now, and we will have to see action on the ground. So it'll be very interesting to see what contribution we can make over the next 2 weeks and influence the final decision at COP28 in I was going to say Sharm, sorry, in Dubai. And my last slide, Tina. So this is my final slide on another important negotiating area for farmers called loss and damage, because as Robert said, agriculture is on the front line, but because our constituency is small, this is not something that the constituency follows in detail, but definitely, as I said at the start of my presentation, an area that a negotiating area that we want to learn more about. So this phrase, loss and damage, is very difficult to define. And I've chosen this one here because it helps me. So this concept of loss and damage means that it's funding for climate damage from the climate that countries can't avoid or adapt to. And they're particularly for those most vulnerable countries. And I would say for some of the most vulnerable sectors like ours. So loss means things that you lose forever, you can't be changed. Some of them, unfortunately, might be lies, but they may be a way of living or a historical site. And damage are things that can be repaired. And it was really interesting to see that crop losses were on one of the suggestions for topics for discussion in the next Sharm joint work. But this area of loss and damage, because it's about funding, has also had a very long and difficult set of negotiations in the UNFCCC process, because it's about fairness and equity and proving historical responsibility for some of this loss and damage that happened. But after very many years of difficult negotiations, it was great that finally last year at COP27, a dedicated fund was agreed on. And now we move on to the next difficult phase. So we agree this principle of a fund, but how is it going to work in practice? How will this be distributed? To whom? These discussions have just started. But what is clear is that there isn't enough money just from developed countries. And that's why this agreement on a fund sees money coming from lots of different places, from the private sector, from philanthropies, from development banks, and also from developing countries who are now perhaps becoming middle income countries, countries like China and Saudi Arabia. And this fund can take many forms. It may not be direct money, but it could be in the form of insurance, for example. So this is definitely an area that the constituency wants to follow. Thanks, Tina. I'll stop there and hand over to you.